The girl arrived at the edge of Prosperity Flats with nothing but the dust on her worn dress and a shovel held tight in one hand, its wooden handle smoothed by a lifetime of work that was not her own. Her name was Ilara, and she was 18 years old, though the look in her eyes belonged to someone much older, someone who had already seen the bottom of the world. Just a week prior, her parents, their minds and kindnesses eroded by cheap liquor, had put her out on the open road, their final act of parenthood a slammed door and a slurred curse. They left her with the shovel, a tool she had used to dig their potato patch, now her only inheritance. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, a waste of water she might need later. Instead, she walked until her feet bled, following the faint promise of a river, seeking a place where she could stop. She carried with her a different kind of inheritance, one that lived not in her hands but in her memory. It was the voice of her grandmother, a woman of the earth, who had taught her things the world had forgotten. "The ground has a memory, child," she used to say, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "It remembers the summer sun deep in the winter. You don't fight the cold. You borrow warmth from something that knows how to keep it." Ilara found her place where the river bent sharply, creating a high, steep bank of dense, red clay. It stood solid, a silent testament to centuries of the water's patient carving. This would be her home. The people of Prosperity Flats, a town built on the new and noisy promise of milled lumber and iron nails, saw her begin her work. They saw a lone girl, a ghost at the edge of their vision, stabbing at the earth with a desperate rhythm. They watched, and they wondered, but no one approached. To them, she was a curiosity, a piece of driftwood washed up on their shores. She worked from dawn until the last light failed, the shovel an extension of her arms. The clay was stubborn, but she was more so. She was not just digging a hole, she was carving out a life, excavating a future from the unforgiving soil. With every shovelful of earth she removed, she felt less like the girl who was abandoned and more like the woman who was beginning. The scent of the damp clay filled her lungs, a smell of resilience, of deep, quiet strength. It was the smell of survival. The town of Prosperity Flats prided itself on looking forward, never back. Its name was a declaration, a challenge to the harsh landscape from which it had been carved. Its buildings were sharp-angled, made of freshly cut pine that still wept sap in the afternoon sun, a testament to industry and ambition. The town council, led by the impeccably dressed Mayor Sterling, spoke often of progress, of civilization, of leaving the old ways behind. The sight of a young woman digging into the riverbank like some desperate creature was, therefore, more than a curiosity, it was an affront to their very identity. After 3 days of her steady labor, a delegation arrived. Mayor Sterling, his silver-topped cane sinking slightly into the soft earth, stood beside Sheriff Vance, a man whose authority rested on the polished shine of his badge. They observed the cavity she had carved, a space now large enough for her to shelter in, and their faces were masks of disapproval. "Young lady," the mayor began, his voice smooth but firm, intended to quell any argument before it started. "We cannot have this. Prosperity Flats is a community of decent, God-fearing folk who live in proper homes. We don't have burrow dwellers here." Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel. She looked not at their faces, but at their feet, at the way their fine leather boots were alien to the soil they stood upon. "It will be a proper home," she said, her voice low and even, not defensive, but factual. "It will be warm when the deep cold comes." Sheriff Vance shifted his weight, his hand resting near his side. "There are laws of decency, miss. Of public order. What you are doing is unnatural." She finally lifted her gaze, and the quiet intensity within it seemed to startle them. "What's unnatural," she replied, "is to freeze in a wooden box when the earth itself is offering you a blanket." Her words, simple and direct, held a wisdom they could not, or would not, understand. They saw madness where she saw logic. They saw destitution where she saw engineering. "The earth holds its heat," she explained, gesturing to the thick clay walls. "It's safer than wood. The wind can't steal the warmth." Mayor Sterling simply shook his head, a dismissive, pitying gesture. "We will be watching you," he declared, a veiled threat. "This town has standards." They turned and walked away, leaving her in a cloud of their certainty, their modern pride a wall as thick as any she was digging. The central challenge was now clear. It was not the clay, nor the coming winter. It was the deliberate ignorance of men who believed their newness made them wise. The story of the river rat, as she was quickly named, became the town's favorite piece of gossip, a source of cruel amusement. Men like Bo and Caleb, young and full of the easy confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, would swagger past her work site on their way to the saloon. They'd stop and watch, their laughter sharp and unkind. "Look at her," Bo would say, loud enough for the whole world to hear. "Scratching at the dirt like a gopher. She'll be buried alive in the first big rain." Caleb would nod in agreement, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her pile of excavated earth. "My PA's hog has a better wallow than that." Their mockery was a constant, buzzing irritation, like flies in the summer heat. Children, learning their cruelty from their parents, took to throwing stones from the top of the bank, the pebbles skittering down near her feet. Ilara never flinched, never shouted back. She simply gathered the stones and used them to line the entrance to her dwelling, turning their malice into a part of her foundation. Her resilience was a mystery to them, and so they ridiculed it. But not everyone saw a fool. From the window of a small, neat house overlooking the river, an old woman named Serafina watched. She had seen more winters than all the men on the town council combined, and she recognized the pattern. She had seen prideful men build their fortunes on sand, and she had seen the quiet and the humble endure. She saw the girl's steady work, the careful way she angled the entrance and smoothed the walls, and she saw not madness, but an ancient and powerful wisdom. One day, a new presence appeared at the edge of Ilara's world. A scrawny dog, its fur a patchwork of brown and white, with one eye clouded over, began to watch her from a safe distance. It was an outcast, just like her. Ilara, whose own hunger was a constant companion, broke off a piece of the stale bread she had for her supper and tossed it toward the animal. It snatched the offering and disappeared. But the next day, it was back, a little closer this time. She named him Patch, and in his silent, hopeful presence, the crushing weight of her solitude began to lift. The stakes were no longer just her own. She was building a home for two. The work was slow, a conversation between her body and the earth. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwood trees along the river in hues of gold and amber. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the chimneys in town. While the people of Prosperity Flats were busy with their own winter preparations, splitting logs, caulking windows, filling their pantries, Ilara's work was of a different nature. It was quieter, more methodical. She was not fighting the coming winter, she was preparing to be held by it. Her shelter was becoming a marvel of simple, intuitive engineering. She had dug a narrow flue up through the top of the bank, packing it with rocks to create a chimney that would draw the smoke from a small, contained fire pit near the entrance. This design would keep the smoke out of her living space while allowing the heat to radiate from the earthen walls. She carved a raised platform from the clay at the back of the chamber, a sleeping ledge that would lift her off the cooler floor. She spent days gathering the driest grasses from the riverbanks, weaving them into thick mats to cover the floor and the sleeping ledge, an extra layer of insulation against the damp. Her movements were economical, born of a need to conserve every ounce of energy. The town saw a girl digging a hole. They did not see the careful science of it, the understanding of airflow, of thermal mass, of the Earth's insulating properties. They saw primitive labor, not sophisticated design. One evening, as dusk settled like a purple blanket over the valley, she found a small bundle left near her entrance. Inside was a thick wool blanket, faded but clean, and a parcel of dried venison. She looked up toward the town and saw a flicker of movement in Serafina's window, the briefest wave of a hand. Ilara clutched the blanket to her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with wool. It was the first act of unsolicited kindness she had known in years. She nodded her thanks into the twilight, a silent acknowledgement passing between the old woman who remembered and the young woman who was putting that memory into practice. With renewed resolve, she continued her work, her partnership with the scrawny dog, Patch, now a settled fact. He would lie nearby as she dug, a silent, one-eyed guardian, and together they watched the season turn, feeling the promise of the coming cold not as a threat, but as a challenge they were uniquely prepared to meet. The late autumn was a deception, a spell of mild, sun-drenched days that lulled Prosperity Flats into a state of complacent confidence. The men in the saloon toasted their good fortune, their voices booming with certainty. Easiest winter we'll ever see, they declared, their predictions as flimsy as the single-pane glass in their windows. They looked at their towering woodpiles, mostly green, unseasoned pine cut just weeks before, and saw security. They saw proof of their foresight. Ilara saw a catastrophe waiting to happen. She felt the change not in the air, but deeper, in the bones of the world. Her grandmother had taught her to read the signs. The geese had flown south weeks earlier than usual. The squirrels were frantic, hoarding every last nut and seed with a desperate intensity. And the river ice, when it first began to form at the edges, was not thick and solid, but a network of thin, brittle sheets that cracked under the slightest pressure. It was called wolf ice, her grandmother had said, because it had teeth. The nights grew unnaturally still, a profound silence that seemed to soak up all sound. This was the most ominous sign of all, the deep, quiet breath the world takes before it screams. A sense of urgency gripped her. She worked faster, reinforcing the entrance to her burrow with a tightly packed wall of sod and rock, leaving only a small, low opening that could be covered with a hide. She gathered fallen branches, not the thick logs the townsmen prized, but smaller, drier pieces that would burn hot and clean with minimal smoke. Inside, her home was ready. The woven grass mats were thick underfoot, the sleeping ledge was softened with more grasses and the precious wool blanket, and a small stack of dry kindling sat ready by the fire pit. She felt she had to try, one last time. She walked into town, Patch trotting at her heels, and found Sheriff Vance locking up his office for the evening. He saw her approach and his face tightened with annoyance. "What do you want, girl?" he asked, his voice sharp. "A bad freeze is coming," she said, her own voice quiet but unwavering. "Worse than you've seen. Your green wood won't burn hot enough to fight it. People will get sick." The sheriff let out a short, harsh laugh. "Are you an expert on the weather now, on top of being an engineer of mud huts?" He gestured grandly at the town around them. "We have sawmills and iron stoves, girl. We have progress. We're not savages living in holes, afraid of a little cold snap. Go back to your mud." He turned his back on her, the finality of his dismissal as cold as the air itself. Ilara stood for a moment, the gas lights of the town casting long, dancing shadows. She had offered them a warning, a gift of ancient knowledge, and they had thrown it back in her face. She turned and walked back to the riverbank, the silence of the night pressing in around her, the deep cold already gathering its strength. It began not with a storm, but with a terrifying stillness. One afternoon, the sun, which had been shining with a pale, watery light, simply vanished behind a wall of slate-grey cloud that rolled in from the north without a sound. Then, the temperature began to fall. It did not drift down, it plummeted, as if the bottom had dropped out of the world. The townsfolk, caught off guard, hurried indoors, laughing about the sudden blue norther. The laughter died in their throats within the hour. The cold was a physical entity, a predator. It seeped through the walls of their proud wooden houses, slid through the cracks in their window frames, and crept across the floors. The very air grew thin and sharp, painful to breathe. The sound of wood groaning and cracking under the strain echoed through the town, punctuated by the sharp reports of nails contracting in the freezing timber. Inside their homes, a desperate battle began. They stuffed their iron stoves with the green, unseasoned pine, which hissed and smoldered, producing thick, acrid smoke but precious little heat. The smoke choked them, but the cold was worse. It was a deep, invasive cold that no blanket could stop. Water froze in barrels, then in pipes, which burst with loud bangs that sounded like gunshots in the frozen silence. Families huddled together in a single room, their breath pluming in the air, their modern homes transformed into ornate, inescapable ice boxes. They were trapped in the brittle shells of their own progress. But in the burrow on the riverbank, a different reality existed. Outside, the wind had risen to a razor-edged shriek, but inside Ilara's home, it was only a distant, muffled whisper. She had lit a small, carefully constructed fire in her pit. The dry wood caught instantly, burning with a clean, intense heat. The smoke was drawn perfectly up the flue, while the warmth radiated outwards, absorbed and held by the dense clay walls. The earth itself was her furnace. She and Patch were curled together on the raised sleeping ledge, wrapped in the wool blanket. The air was warm and still, filled with the primal, comforting scents of earth, dry grass, and wood smoke. She listened to the storm rage outside, a god of destruction trying to claw its way in, but the earth held her safe in its embrace. She was not fighting the cold. She was living within the one thing powerful enough to defy it. While a town built on pride was freezing, the girl they had mocked was warm, protected by the very ground they scorned. The Great Freeze held Prosperity Flats in its icy grip for 2 full days and nights. On the third morning, the wind finally died, leaving behind a world encased in a brittle, glittering shell of ice. A profound, unnatural silence descended, the silence of a world holding its breath. Then, a sound broke the stillness. It was a raw, desperate cry, a man's voice cracking with fear. It was Bo. His bravado, his mockery, his pride, all of it had been frozen and shattered. He stumbled from his house, his face a mask of terror. His young son, Leo, was sick with a fever, and in the relentless cold of their home, the boy's breathing had become shallow, his skin a deathly pale. The house was a tomb, and the cold was stealing his child. In his desperation, his mind seized on a single, impossible image, the girl, the river rat, and the faint, impossible wisp of smoke he had seen rising from her burrow even as the freeze began. It was a mad hope, but it was the only one he had. He ran, slipping and falling on the icy ground, his lungs burning with every frigid breath. He scrambled down the riverbank and saw it, a thin, steady plume of smoke rising from the flue, a sign of life in a dead world. He fell to his knees at the low entrance, the hide covering pushed aside. The wave of warmth that flowed out was so shocking, so profound, it felt like a dream. Ilara was there, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her small fire. "Please," Bo sobbed, the word torn from him, all his former arrogance gone, replaced by the pure, primal terror of a father. "My boy. He's freezing. Please, help us." Ilara looked at the man who had been her chief tormentor. She saw no triumph in his humiliation, only his pain. Without a word, she moved aside, making space in the small, warm haven. Her gesture was simple, unambiguous. It said, "Bring him in." Bo scrambled back to his house, his heart pounding with a fragile, burgeoning hope. He returned moments later, carrying his son, who was wrapped in every blanket they owned but still shivering violently. He carefully passed the small, limp body through the opening. The moment Leo was inside the shelter, out of the wind and into the steady, enveloping warmth, the shivering began to subside. Bo crawled in after him, the life-saving heat washing over him, and he began to weep, his shame and gratitude an unbearable weight. The outcast had become the savior. The transformation of Bo was only the beginning. News, carried by the desperate hope of one father, spread through the frozen town with astonishing speed. Soon, another figure appeared at the top of the riverbank, silhouetted against the pale, icy sky. It was Sheriff Vance, his face grim, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He was not there to enforce any law, he was there to beg. His own wife was ill, her cough worsening by the hour in their frigid home. He did not speak, he only looked at Ilara, his eyes conveying the plea his pride would not let him voice. She nodded, and he left, returning with his frail wife. Then came others. The baker, with his 2 young daughters. The blacksmith's elderly mother. One by one, the people of Prosperity Flats, stripped of their pride and their certainty, made the pilgrimage to the riverbank. They came to the door of the girl they had ridiculed, seeking sanctuary in the home they had called a hole. The last to arrive was Mayor Sterling. His fine wool coat, which had seemed so impressive just days before, now looked absurdly inadequate. He stood at the entrance, his face etched with a shame so deep it had carved new lines into his skin. He looked at the interior of the burrow, at the smooth, earthen walls glowing in the firelight, at the frightened but warming faces of his citizens huddled together, at the quiet girl at the center of it all. "We built on top of the land," he said, his voice raspy and low, a public confession. "You built with it. We were fools. It was more than an apology, it was a reckoning." The collective arrogance of the town, the very foundation upon which Prosperity Flats had been built, had crumbled. Inside the small, warm space, there were no mayors or sheriffs, no mockers or outcasts. There were only people, united by the shared, elemental need for warmth, a need that had been met not by progress or industry, but by the quiet, enduring wisdom of the earth, channeled through the hands of a single, resilient girl. Ilara moved among them, offering sips of warm, herb-infused water she had prepared, her movements calm and efficient. She spoke little, but her presence was a powerful anchor in their world of chaos. They had called her the river rat, but now, in the warm safety of her home, they saw her for what she was, their deliverance. The Great Freeze of '88, as it came to be known, was not the end of Prosperity Flats, it was its true beginning. The event became a defining legend, a harsh but necessary lesson etched into the town's soul. When the thaw finally came and the people returned to their damaged homes, they were changed. They looked at their town not with pride, but with a new, critical humility. They had survived, but only because they had been saved by the very wisdom they had scorned. The change was not just emotional, it was architectural. Led by a humbled Mayor Sterling, the townsfolk began to rebuild, but this time, they did so with the earth in mind. They sought out Ilara, no longer an outcast but a respected teacher. They asked her to show them. Quietly, patiently, she shared what her grandmother had taught her. She showed them how to build sod houses, their walls thick with the insulating power of the prairie. She taught them how to construct deep cellars that would stay cool in the brutal summer heat and remain above freezing in the deepest winter. They learned to orient their homes to catch the winter sun and to plant trees as wind breaks. The town that had once been a monument to man's opposition to nature became a model of cooperation with it. Ilara never lorded her knowledge over them. Her authority was quiet, rooted in visible proof and lived experience. She eventually expanded her own Riverbank home, creating more rooms within the clay, and it became a sort of community center, a place where people came for advice, for comfort, or just to sit by the fire. Years passed. Prosperity Flats, once ironically named, grew to earn its title. It became known as a place of hardy, sensible people who knew how to live in a hard land. Its reputation spread, and a new kind of legacy was born. Settlers heading for the even harsher territories of the north began to make a point of stopping in the town. They did not come for supplies or rest, they came for knowledge. They came to learn how to build the Ilara homes, the earth-sheltered dwellings that could withstand the worst a winter could throw at them. A young woman's act of solitary survival, born of abandonment and ancient wisdom, had become a blueprint for life across the frontier, a quiet revolution of humility and dirt. An old woman now, Ilara sat at the smoothed entrance of her home, the one she had carved from the earth so many years ago. The late afternoon sun warmed her face, and the river flowed past, a steady, constant companion. Beside her sat Serafina, her friend of decades, their silence comfortable, filled with a shared history. At her feet lay a dog, a descendant of the one-eyed patch, its coat the same patchwork of brown and white. From her vantage point on the bank, Ilara could see Prosperity Flats, a town that hummed with a quiet, resilient life. The houses were no longer just sharp-angled boxes of pine, they were softened by sod roofs and nestled into the landscape, a part of the earth, not just sitting upon it. Her gaze drifted over the town, and the narrator's voice, a quiet moral authority, might ask you, the viewer, what is the foundation of a true home? Is it built of wooden nails, of pride and ambition? Or is it carved from something deeper, from humility, from an understanding that we are not masters of this world, but a part of it? The story of Ilara is a story of survival, yes, but it is more than that. It is a quiet reflection on the nature of wisdom. In a world that rushes toward the new, the shiny, the complex, we so often dismiss the old, the simple, the profound. We mistake knowledge, which is the accumulation of facts, for wisdom, which is the understanding of how things connect. The men of Prosperity Flats had knowledge of sawmills and iron stoves, but Ilara had the wisdom of the earth. They built walls to keep the cold out, she found a place where the warmth was already kept. How often do we, in our own lives, do the same? How often do we build our lives on foundations of pride, brittle and exposed, ready to shatter in the first great freeze? We surround ourselves with the illusion of security, only to find ourselves shivering when the real storms come. Ilara's legacy was not in the houses that bore her name, but in the lesson she embodied. True strength, true resilience, is not found in defiance of the natural world, but in alignment with it. It is the quiet strength of the river that shapes the stone, the silent power of the seed that breaks the ground, the enduring warmth of the earth that holds the memory of the sun. Her life was a testament, a simple, poetic truth. The safest place to be in a storm is in the heart of that which is stronger and older than the storm itself.